Today on the Roundhouse, we're going behind the scenes of model railroad manufacturing with Broadway Limited Imports. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to the Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozarek, and this is episode number 144 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby. You name it, and we discuss it. Today, we're talking to Curtis Koch of Broadway Limited Imports about the history of their company, some of their products, how they go through the design and production of their model trains, and I'm glad you're here to enjoy it. Before we get to that, though, I first want to thank those of you who are supporting the Roundhouse on Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/theroundhouse for as little as $1 a month, you can be supporting the show and what we do here. And I want to thank Paul Creamer and Forrest Runner, who recently joined. And if you want to see what other kinds of cool perks you get, patreon.com/theroundhouse. And I want to thank the Mechanical Services Department of the Strasburg Railroad for sponsoring this episode. Learn more at mechanical.strasburgrailroad.com. Our guest today is the Director of Sales and Marketing for Broadway Limited Imports. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Mr. Curtis Koch.
Nick, thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
It's great to have you on. I love going behind the scenes of model railroad and manufacturing. It's something that many of us enjoy and take for granted, these tiny little delicate works of art that we get to enjoy on our tabletops.
Yeah, and it's always fun to dive into kind of how it gets made. And I know a lot of your listeners are probably model railroaders, or they're involved in preservation and, all that sort of stuff. And basically any sort of train fan probably at some point had a train set around their Christmas tree or something like that. And there's a lot of fun that goes into this industry, and there's a lot of hardships and, other things like that. And I'm sure we'll dig into all of that as we go through the episode today. But thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. I'm so excited to be here.
Let's first establish, what is the history of Broadway Limited Imports?
Yeah, so the company was founded in 2001 by our president and CEO, Bob Gruba. He also had two co-founders, Anton and Bob, a different Bob. Our current president and CEO, Bob Gruba, he is the remaining of those original three members. And like I said, he's our president and CEO. They both came up with the idea of introducing sound into a model train. And our first model was a New York Central J3A Hudson. And that was SKU number 001. And it came out back in about 2001. And that was, at the time, a partnership with QSI Sound Systems. And we had QSI Sound Systems in our models for probably about 5 or 6 years until we started Precision Craft models in 2006. And Precision Craft models used ESU electronics in there. And eventually, when we kind of merged the two companies together in 2009, we first started using our own in-house decoders, which were Paragon decoders, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with today. We got introduced into the N-Skill market with the Alco PAs and EMD units in about 2006. And then we introduced our Paragon 2 system of electronics in 2009. We designed it in-house along with Paragon 3 and Paragon 4. And we're still going strong all these years later, 20 plus years later, and making models that everybody loves, everybody has on their home layouts or at their clubs. And like I said, still going strong to this day, 20 plus years later.
Can we take a moment to appreciate, or at least what seems to be a little bit of irony, that the first locomotive that Broadway Limited imports, Broadway Limited being a Pennsylvania Railroad train, made was a New York Central locomotive. Am I right that that is a little bit of an irony?
Yes. it It's incredibly ironic, and I hear that at least 3 to 4 times in a typical show. When I go to a show, I've heard it at the Rocky Mountain show most recently, last April, when a couple of guys came up to me and said, for a company named after Pennsylvania Railroad, they brought the same thing you just mentioned, that you guys have a New York Central engine as your first model. And it is ironic. It's fun. It's fun to joke around with stuff like that. But obviously, we've come a long way since that first model, and there's just a lot of fun little nuances about that irony in that sentence that you brought up.
Speaking of train shows, we'll be recording this before, but we will be releasing it after the big Amherst train show in Springfield, Massachusetts at the end of January. You've teased that you've got some big announcements that you'll be rolling out there. So, what are those big announcements as examples of some of the products that you offer?
Yeah, so 2024 is going to be a big year for us for a lot of different reasons, a lot of new stuff we've been working on. Our first announcement for 2024 that you mentioned we brought up at Amherst, we are working on a Penzi passenger set. So it'll be a 5-car set. It'll include our newly tooled, new details, new lighting, all that sort of thing. PB70 combine car, 3 P70 coaches. And each set will have a specific era. So if you model the Penzi in the 1940s, we have a 1940s era set with details that would have been accurate for the Pennsylvania Railroad during the 1940s. If you do the 1930s, we have that version of a set. Or if you do the 1950s, we have that version of a set. Again, same sort of thing, details specific for the railroad during that time frame. We have a couple different versions of the combine car. And along with that, you'll get 3 P70 coaches, like I mentioned, and also our newly tooled Z74D business cars. We have 6 different offerings of those business cars in Pennsylvania Railroad. Specific details, naming, lettering, paint, all that sort of stuff. So you get a 5-car set with that, and each of the combine and the business cars will be available individually. So if you have already the P70 coaches and you want to add a combine to your train, or maybe you already have a couple of Pennsylvania Railroad passenger trains and you want to add some style on the rear end of it, we got the Pennsylvania business car for you too. And further on, I know this will be released a little bit later, but we do have a generic business car kind of based off of the Z74D tooling. We'll offer that in Northern Pacific, C&O, Santa Fe, Union Pacific, Southern Pacific. So there'll be other variations of this business car that any sort of modeler who wants to add a little bit to their business car fleet or to their era-specific passenger trains that are looking for some stylish rolling stock at the back end, that'll be perfect for you. The other thing that's nice about these cars, too, is that we've gone to really great lengths, and we've worked with the Pennsylvania Railroad Historical Society and Modeling Society. So we were able to get really good details in photos of the inside of the car. So the inside of the interior is spectacular. Everything from a mantle with a bookshelf and some drawers to the couches and the chairs, the cigarette and drink stands that were prototypical for that era back then. And the coolest part about this is that each light, there's going to be multiple lighting functions. You can have the tail light turn on. You can turn on the interior lighting, all of which will be individually controlled. And the modeler will be able to customize their experience with however individual lights they want on at a certain time while they have these cars on their layout. So really, really neat passenger cars. And I know we've teased in the past, we're also working on the Union Pacific excursion fleet cars, not so much the ones that Walters has already released, but we're working specifically on the business cars of that you would see behind the Big Boy or 844 today. Those cars in particular are 101, which is known as Lone Star or Lincoln, 102, which is St. Louis, 103, which is Cheyenne, 114, Feather River, and 119, Kennefic. So those 5 business cars are the ones that we're working on as well, that we think our customers are going to love, especially behind their Paragon 4 FEFs and Paragon 4 big boys that are not only just out now, but also we have a second run of big boys coming out too. So lots of fun stuff rolling stock wise. And we've got new locomotives in the works that I can't quite tell you yet what they are, but we do have some new locomotives, some of which have never been offered from us before, that will be new coming in 2024, that we think, again, our customers are going to love.
Talking about these passenger cars makes me think of one of the first times that your company's name really stood out to me as I ogled at pieces of equipment that I don't own that I wish I did, and that is the California Zephyr set that you released, 10 years ago. It's been a while, but that's how long I've been ogling at it.
And we get asked all the time, will we do another run of those cars? We really would like to. Just to give you a perspective, the tooling cost when we made that set, 10 years ago, was about $1 million in total for the entire 13 car set. Obviously, with inflation and everything like that that's been going on, that set would probably be, in our estimations, 2 to 3 times, because the tooling is outdated. So we'd have to retool the entire train. It would be a lot of money for us. And so we're not ready to do that at this time. We would like to do it at some point in the future. Hopefully when inflation and costs for materials and stuff go down, we really would like to redo those cars. We get asked about that in the daylight sets too, the most. And it's the same thing. It's too costly to do a 12, 13 car train. In terms of the 5-car sets that we just asked, I know people are like, well, you're offering another 5-car set. Yeah, we are. But the tooling that we've had for 3 of the 5 cars have already existed in our P70 coaches. The only other tooling that we're really paying for in that aspect is the combine car and the business car. So that's what makes the kind of the difference between doing that. And with the UP business cars too, those are each individual cars. It's not a part of a larger set. So it's, again, more cost effective for us to add that aspect of doing individual cars that might not be out there in the market, or if they are in the market, they're very rare to come by. And we're able to do it our style, our way, and make a really nice piece of rolling stock for people, and do it a more cost-effective stuff for us. But my dad had a CB&Q version of the California Zephyr. My dad, growing up, is a big Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy fan. We grew up in the Midwest in Chicago. So he loves that train set. He still sends me occasionally pictures and videos of it running on his home layout. And that train just stands out. And I see people will share photos and videos of it too all the time. It's just such a beautiful set. Trust me, I wish we could make it. I really wish we could. It's just a little too cost effective for us at this time. But hopefully, maybe 3-ish years down the road, we might reconsider doing it again. And hopefully the cost of everything will be going down so we can bring it, again, really, really well back to market.
When you bring up the cost of tooling, one of the things I'm always interested in is how a company selects its project. Looking at your website now, some of the things that you're offering, you've got your classic lineup of steam locomotives, and then you have everything from early generation to modern diesel locomotives. So you have a spread. What are the factors that determine what projects you choose to pursue?
Some of it is, for example, if you're looking at our modern diesels, if we've done a run of it already, like we already brought it to market from us, and there's enough demand there that we feel like, or if the sales numbers were really well, we could offer a second run, do some alternate road numbers, alternate paint schemes. In this newest run of ES44s we're doing, we brought the St. John's Express unit, the Canadian Pacific orange Gevo with the Hapag Lloyd writing on the side. And we're also bringing the Baltimore and Ohio CSX Heritage unit to market as well. And it gives us the ability to offer unique things like that. But when it comes to tooling or anything like that for a GS4 or for a FEF, a lot of times we have to look at the market and see when was the last time something like this was released. If we have already made it, how are the sales on that before? That sort of thing. F units and switchers in both HO and N scale are, for us, are kind of the reruns that we do pretty frequently because of the fact that we have the tooling for it already done, and we just got to select some new paint schemes and new road numbers, and we can do another run, and it'll do pretty well sales wise. So those are kind of like bread and butter projects, if you will, that will help pay the bills, help pay the service department and staff members like myself who work at the company. So it's really important that we do have some projects like that. But it's also great because we can offer so many new and unique things. For example, with the HO scale version of our SD70 Aces, we know that model's been made pretty consistently out there, but what can we do to make it stand out that a customer might want to purchase ours versus a competitor's? Well, for us, we decided, well, what if we made it in die cast? And we look at the success of our steam locomotives and the pulling power that the steam locomotives had with their die cast and brass tooling versus plastic. And it's night and day difference. And we hear it from our customers at shows all the time that, that they want our big boys because they can pull. They want our N scale, big boys because they can pull. They want our N scale Y6Bs because they can pull. When we show videos of, a N scale Y6B pulling a full size brick that's probably used on your home right now, it just goes to show the strength that we have in our models and the robust design that we put behind it. But for us, when it comes to doing those projects, finding something unique that hasn't been done before, we're not afraid to do. It's like I said, the die cast SD70 Ace with a die cast metal chassis, a die cast shell, metal etched handrails, and grab irons. It's different, but it's something that, like I said, it's something unique. And one thing that we've heard from our customers that they want our diesels to pull a little bit more. And so coming up with this idea to do a little bit of a die cast version, we haven't gotten any samples yet. We're hoping in the next couple of weeks to get some samples, but we kind of estimate this model to be anywhere between 1 to 3 pounds for just a singular SD70 Ace, which seems like a lot for an engine that's probably 6 or 7 inches long. But the pulling power is what we've heard most from our customers as what they want in some of our diesels. And if we're able to do that, that's awesome. And we're more than happy to come up with those innovative ways to keep people wanting to come back to us and purchase more of our models.
One of the lines that you've rolled out recently within the past few years are these brass hybrid models with your steam locomotives. What are the decisions that go into making a model using brass? When a lot of model railroaders think of brass, they're thinking of the imports from 30 to 50 years ago. What are the advantages of it today for what you're doing?
It honestly kind of depends project to project. Usually what it comes down to is tooling costs. For example, our daylights are die cast, and it's more cheaper or cost effective, I should say, for us to do a daylight and die cast versus a brass hybrid. Our Pennsylvania Railroad Q2 that's coming out later this year is another example of it's cheaper for us to make it in and die cast. And a lot of it is the parts that are readily available. It's more cost effective, and the details too. It's more cost effective some projects in brass over die cast, depending upon how detailed the model is. And I'm not saying that our die cast engines aren't as detailed as our brass engines. It's just more of the parts that are readily available. For example, a lot of other companies have made GS4s in the past out of plastic or die cast, and a lot of times those parts are more readily available for us to purchase at a price point that we can make the model still affordable for the customer. Whereas if a rarer model such as our Texas and Pacific 210-4s, part of the brass hybrid line, those parts in die cast aren't as readily available for us to use versus brass. So a lot of times it's determining on what parts are available, what can we make it for at the more cost-effective parts of the tooling, where we can still have a highly detailed model, but get it to the customer at a price point that they can afford and bring home to their model railroad.
So with all of these offerings that you have right now, I have to ask you, Curtis, what is your personal fave? What is going to find a treasured spot on your shelf or your layout either because it fits with what you model already or just because you love what it is?
Oh, wow. So I have several. Let me start off with two that are very personal to me, or actually rather three. Um, I love the Santa Fe Railroad. So my favorite steam locomotive that I had, which was actually my first Broadway engine, was a QSI Santa Fe 3751 Northern. So I love that engine. I still have it. It still runs great. But most recently, two engines that I had the pleasure of actually getting able to ride behind is my Paragon 3 Milwaukee Road 261, my Paragon 3 Challenger 3985. Both locomotives came to the Midwest. The 261 came down to Milwaukee, and living in Illinois, it was only about an hour-ish drive to Milwaukee from my house. So it was easy to get tickets to ride behind that locomotive. And my dad and I have fond memories of standing out in the vestibule, and with it being a coal-fired engine, we had these goggles on our face because we're getting pelted with cinders as we're riding behind the locomotive, which was a blast. And then the Challenger, I grew up watching Pentrex videos, and Nick, I listened to your episode with the narrator of
Dave Drury.
Dave, thank you. Yes, the narrator of Pentrex. I grew up watching Pentrex videos all the time, and I watched in particular Steam to Chicago, and I loved watching the Challenger on that. And so in 2002, that locomotive came to Chicago. It went from the West Chicago Metro station up to Milwaukee and back, and my dad and I had dome car seats, and so we got to sit in the dome car behind the Challenger, and that was also a blast. So I still have the Challenger. I still have the 261. But more recently, in terms of Paragon 4 stuff, I love our brass hybrid Blue Goose. We were just talking about brass hybrids. So that's one of my more recent favorite models. I also love our FEF3s we made. So I have 844, a part of that as well. And then on the diesel side, I love our E units and F units. I have several of those as well. But most recently, the two diesels that I've come to really enjoy from us are the newest ones that have just come out, are the GP30s. I have two in Santa Fe paint that I test ran the other day at my club, and both ran awesome. And the details on those are awesome. And it's fun to be able to get involved a little bit and help pinpoint some areas where, we can tweak the tooling, because, the Santa Fe one had this, or tweak the sounds even more so because the Santa Fe had this particular horn on it, or, Pennsylvania Railroad had this horn or bell combo, on it. So that's another perk about being in this job, is that you get to really add some more resources and add some more perspective onto these models. And it's just so fun to have all of that sort of stuff. And like I said, I grew up, getting Broadway limited models for Christmas. So being able to work here at Broadway and being able to be a part of it is a blast. It's fun to sit in the office and talk to Ken Silvestri every once in a while about how different things that we have ideas and whatnot. So those, go back to your question though. That's the handful of models that I've enjoyed so far. But top three would be the three locomotives I mentioned earlier: the Challenger, the Milwaukee Road 261, and my Santa Fe Northern.
The perks of the job are undoubtedly evident.
Yes, very, very much so. And it's fun to have that influence on that. We mentioned the Union Pacific business cars. Matt Williamson came to me. He's like, what do you think would go well with our FEFs and big boys that have, sold really well? And that was the first thing that I suggested. And it's been really fun to be involved in not only influencing the design, but pointing out details that need to be on the model and that sort of thing. So it's so fun to get involved and to be a part of a project like that. And I already told Matt, I'm like, I'm placing an order for all five when they come out. I'll be the first one to have my order in. It's just cool to be a part of that and have that opportunity to, like I mentioned, influence and give a chance to make things that not only just myself, but other customers want. And it's just so cool to see how rewarding that is when people hear that we're making something that they really want, and they just light up with excitement, especially at shows. You get to see that a lot in person.
The Strasburg Railroad is an institution in the heritage railroad industry, and its mechanical services department is proud to lead the way. With the knowledge and experience that has created one of the most reliable steam railroading experiences in the country, the Strasburg Railroad is excited to offer their expertise to the rest of the industry. Strasburg's professional team provides consulting and technical assistance to take your steam locomotive or railcar project from idea to finished product. They stand behind their work and always strive to meet their customers' needs for quality, historic accuracy, and reliability at a price that is fair. Unlike many competitors, they feature a fully equipped boiler, railcar, and machine shop, so the work gets done in-house, helping you get more for your money. Send your inquiries to mechanical@strasburgrailroad.com and let the professionals get to work for you. It's good that you're giving some love to the business car fleet side of things, because when it comes to passenger cars, I think a lot of times the focus is on the name trains of 60 or 70 years ago, which obviously my love of California Zephyr comes through and the Canadian. But to have cars that fit in a modern context but are these older cars, I'm an East Coast guy. So to me, it's like I'd love to see the Norfolk Southern business train with those classic F units and those cars. And I can understand the challenges of making something like that because the NS business fleet cars are very specific, and I imagine the UP ones are too. So it is, as you said, justifying the tooling costs, but it does offer a different side of railroading when you're looking at these executive fleets and these special trains, if you will.
And the other difficulty too, and I don't know if this has been a problem that other manufacturers have come across, but for me, when I was helping research the model, a lot of these corporations, they're class one railroads. You don't get very close access. I mean, with the big boy and the Challenger and 844, that's one thing because they have those cars to pull, and so there's a lot of different videos and stuff out there. And a lot of times when they're parked and they're on display, people will get reference shots. But when it goes to a project like that, and when you want to knock a project like that out of the park, when especially there's so many details, and I mentioned this on other podcasts before, that we're kind of in the golden era of model railroading because everything is so incredibly detailed from the ground up. Every little detail doesn't go unnoticed. And it's at times difficult because, for example, the underbody detail, where are you going to find a photo of the underside of car 101, 102, or 103? If railroad police caught somebody sneaking out underneath one of those cars, they'd be arrested. They're impossible to find virtually on all that stuff. So you really got to dig through the internet, through resources. And I mentioned earlier that we worked with the Pennsylvania Railroad Historical Society. And a lot of times on these projects, like these business cars, we work with like the Union Pacific Historical Society, and they're able to provide us with not only just incredible details and drawings, but they're also able to pinpoint, if you're going to focus on the modern day version of these cars, here's the details you need to focus on. Here's the correct names for modern day, because as I'm sure cars names and stuff have changed and they get rebuilt and they get modified and whatnot. So as things go along, you got to make sure that you're staying on top of it and you're offering it. You're offering what you're selling. If it's a modern day car, 2024, 2023, you better not have the older details that aren't there now from 2015. So you got to make sure that you're doing your research. You got to be asking the right people. And thankfully, we got a good group of people that we can work with that are more than happy to give us an opinion on something, lend a hand in trying to get some extra research, photography, all that stuff. It really is a big challenge for something like that. But like I said, when you knock it out of the park and when people see that you're making it, it's very rewarding to put in all that hard work.
Undoubtedly, because there's so many steps to things. And I want to look at the steps that go into a project. One of the announcements that you made last year that really stood out to me, because it's such an unusual type of locomotive and the size for the type, and that is the Class D 4-truck Shay. We've seen Shays before in various different scales, but this is the 4-truck. This is the big one. So I'm wondering if you can, for no other reason than to indulge my personal curiosity, talk about the development of a project like that and clarify what are the standard steps that would be taken regardless of the type of locomotive and what is specific to this model.
In terms of from start to finish, it all starts with an idea. everybody in the office has a whiteboard of things we'd like to make in steam, diesel, electric, et cetera. And the Class D Shay, the 4-truck Shay came up. And usually when it goes into something like that, we look, has it been offered recently? Has it been something that's been mass produced? We kind of internally talk about, is this something that we think would continue to sell well? And would that be something that would people be interested? How many prototypes of the model are there remaining, if there's any remaining? And then we kind of from there, if we're decided that we're going to go with it, it begins the design process and research and development. But we start with research and development. From there, we're looking up photos and getting research. And thankfully, there's a lot of groups and preservationists out there that are, again, when you tell them that you're working on this particular project, they're more than happy to assist in you. So it might usually start with that. We'll reach out to somebody and say, hey, we're working on this. Do you guys have any information on this said project? And a lot of times, if they have something great, we would definitely take it and use it. One particular example that was helpful was our C&O K2 Mikados. We asked the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad Historical Society about any tips that they have, and they actually sent us not only just some drawings and references, but they actually had a CD, a physical CD of recordings of the K2 Mikado that we were able to rip out. Joe Goddard, who's our sound engineer, did a great job cleaning up a lot of that and then repurposing it, what could be used at least, into the model. But besides that, sticking to the standard version of like what goes into it, once we get enough reference material in terms of photography, if there's any videos, any designs and drawings and that sort of stuff, we send it off to our design team, and they go ahead and they probably, depending upon the project, will take about anywhere between 2 to 3, maybe at most 4 months to put the 3D renderings and designs together for a particular project. And then from there, we'll get those drawings back, those designs back. We'll look at the details again from referencing photos and whatnot, and we'll go back and say, hey, this needs to be tweaked, or this part here is too big. And, from there, we kind of decide what needs to be tweaked, and then we send it back. And then it's kind of a back and forth process. And with our designers being across the world and in Vietnam, and our factory being in China, there's a big time gap there where it'll take a couple, like I said, 3 to 4 months, something, to get a design put together that we want to go with. From there, we move on to the next part where we get our first sample. And those of you who saw us at Amherst might have seen the Class D Shay sample. And the first sample we get is basically a functioning sample, but it doesn't have the final tooling and everything. It's just a basic sample for testing the functionality of, for steam locomotives, like the drive gear, for diesels, putting the shell on top of the chassis and making sure that it navigates curbs and stuff like that. We call that, like I said, a functionality sample. And then from there, once we give our notes back to the team in the factory, we'll get a sample a few months later, because our factory besides, giving us samples to do, they still got to put together models. And for us, we're in a situation where we actually share a factory with 2 other competitors. So for us, it's a little bit more of, again, a wait and see game, because the factory might not be able to make us a new sample for a month or so while they're working on, producing a model either of ours or another company's, however, it goes. And then from there, once we get more samples in and we test them, and we get the approval to go through with the factory, we're probably looking all together from start to finish, probably anywhere between 12 to 15 months. And sometimes there's setbacks in between there where something isn't running right and we have to send notes back. Our GS4s had a little bit of an issue, and we had to keep resending it back to the factory, and the factory kept sending us new samples, and we weren't able to give it the okay to go into production at the time we wanted. So there's a lot of setbacks, and even with COVID still there, but the shipping is still not fully back to what it once was pre-COVID. So that's still another struggle. So there's a lot of factors that go into it, but from an idea to finish of a model being in a customer's hands and on their railroad, it's anywhere between 12 to 15 months in that time frame. Sometimes it's quicker. if again the process goes through really quickly. But most of the time it's between 12 to 15 months before something comes out.
That's such an impressive process. There's so many stages of things, and that ability to coordinate all these different ends, especially when you have your offices in Florida and then you have the production happening elsewhere. You bring up the fact that the actual manufacturing takes place at a factory where some of your competitors' models are made. What is your philosophy on what competition is in terms of model railroading? Because it is and it isn't in a way. And that's something that I learned from my conversations with Rapido. So what are your views on what competition means for BLI?
Yeah, for us, it's people who make models in the same scales that we do, HO and N primarily. Um, those are who we look at as to what our at least direct competitors, Rapido being one, Athearn, Atlas, Walthers, the list goes on and on. And trust me, we all being modelers ourselves here love what everybody else is doing. But a lot of times, it's still a business. We still got to go through that whole process. But for us, we share a factory with two other companies, names who I have not mentioned, just for clarification purposes. And for us, one I would say is not a direct competitor of ours, and another I would say handles more of a different market than compared to what we are. So there's times where, for example, one of the companies, we might share some tooling designs if they are willing to, but it usually comes at a cost. And that's kind of at the most I can kind of go into as to what we do on our factory stuff. But the other things is, like I said, mainly our competition is what manufacturers make scale wise, or make models in the scales that we make. And again, those being HO and N scale. And I would say that the most interesting part of all of that is the fact that there are so many companies making so many different things across the board that when we talk about what's coming to market, I'm not just speaking for us. I'm sure the competitors that you've listed and I've listed are doing the same thing. They got to monitor what's making what, because we might make something, and if Rapido announces something, a couple weeks later or something like that, or it might be something that we might have been working on but haven't officially announced, then we might be like, okay, well, maybe we got to rethink this. Are we going to be sure that we can sell enough of it? So there's a lot of decisions that go on behind the scenes when it comes to that sort of thing. So it is kind of watching the markets, watching what other companies are announcing. But that's what I would say is, answer your question about competition, is kind of evaluating who is our direct competition.
From my perspective, it's competition in the sense that your model railroader, your average model railroader, is going to have a budget. They're going to have only so much money that they can spend on these big fancy toys. That said, I'd like to believe that it is sort of a rising tide carries all ships sort of scenario, where if companies are producing products that complement each other, and at time frames where people can get the locomotives from this company and the rolling stock from that company, and that there is this supportive community, even though, yes, you have to make your money, but it's not like you're trying to drive everybody else out of town, because there is this admiration and recognition that everybody's bringing something slightly different.
Yeah, and a lot of times, I would say that it gets interesting to the point where you're almost being too cautious with what you're thinking about, because we are known for our steam locomotives, and something that we're always taking pride of is bringing something new to market. And then you sit back and you think to yourself, okay, they are also making a steam locomotive, they're also making a steam locomotive, what else do they have planned, and are they going to go down this route? I didn't even mention scale trains. We're talking about steam locomotives. We've made the Class J, and Scale Trains has said a few times that they're making the Class J. So even though we've been asked by many customers, are we going to make that locomotive again? It's not to say we won't. It's just that the timing never usually works out for that in that point in time. Another example would be when we announced we were making the FEF3s a couple of years ago. Athearn came out a couple of weeks after us, and I'm pretty sure Athearn had no idea that we were making it, as we didn't know that they were going to make it either. But the point being is that everybody is kind of just thinking of new ideas, and they want to get it out there. And when it comes to it, you're like, oh, dang, is this going to be something that we can carve ourselves into and get some of the sales in that? And overall, I would say everybody does a pretty good job of keeping track as to where everybody's at, I would say. But it's very fun and interesting to see, again, where everybody is going on different directions, on different projects and whatnot. And that's what kind of makes the hobby fun, because there's so many different options of things that customers can buy. I mean, I've said myself, I'm a modeler. So if I wanted to buy a particular brass car or a plastic car of some sort, you got to analyze which car has the more tooling, that if it fits you or not, kind of going through all that, how serious you are of a modeler. There's a lot of people that I've met that are coming into the hobby that are more casual modelers. So they aren't for all the details. They are more about trying to get it at a good price point, which I think everybody is trying to strive to. But at some point you got to, recognize that, like I said, we're kind of in the golden age here, where everybody's making everything so dang detailed now. It's almost impossible at times to find a good, budget model, because even some of the more basic models are still at times somewhat, costly. If you're paying, $30 or something for a basic freight car, or something like that, that can be, for some people, at times not troubling, but maybe more difficult to determine if they want to add that to their collection, depending upon their budget. And everybody's got different things financially going on at this point in time. And it's just an interesting process, like I said, through thick and thin on this.
There's always so much debate about if the hobby's dying and isn't, and that's not really the point of it for me. But what I am always curious in is what the market demand is for when it comes to people getting into model railroading. So a lot of your models, they are very highly detailed, and so they are coming at that mid price point, what one typically pays for a steam locomotive or a diesel locomotive in this day and age. From what you've seen through COVID and post COVID, is this a market that's still saying we want this level of detail, or are you seeing a market that's willing to sacrifice detail if it means a cheaper price point?
I would say overall, it's definitely a market that is looking for almost an exact replica of the prototype. Now, some things are difficult to replicate in that aspect. People have been asking us for years to make the PRR S1. And we have been really struggling on getting the design for that, because for us, a challenge like making a highly detailed model would be, okay, if we make the S1 like the real thing, it probably won't navigate curves under 30-inch radiuses. And I don't know about you, Nick, but I know my personal home layout that my dad has, and a few other home layouts that I've gone up to run trains on, their minimum radius is maybe 28, 26 inches. So for a Pennsylvania Railroad modeler, how can they justify buying a $400 or $500 PRR S1 if it won't run on their layout? And so that's some of the challenges that we face, and that if we wanted to, we could kind of make it like a Challenger or a Big Boy, where it can be articulated and it can navigate those tighter curves, but you don't get the high detailed and the realistic model that you want. And that's some struggles of that, where people want to have, their Dash 9 be exactly as it is in today's time, or their SD45 in a time period between 1975 and 1980, stuff like that. So there are some manufacturers that do really well at that. I like to think that we are one of those, where we try to make it as best to the prototype as we can. But for some models like the S1, it's incredibly difficult to come up with that determination of, are our customers going to want the most accurate PRR S1, or like the prototype couldn't navigate some of those tighter curves or fit on a turntable. How are we going to be able to bring that to market as detailed and as accurate as possible, but also make it to where people can afford it and run it on their layouts? So there's a lot of struggles like that across the board with not only just us, but I'm sure with other manufacturers that have had the same sort of thing too. So that's just kind of an example of where I think people want the most detailed model they can get, but at what cost and what sacrifices do us as manufacturers have to make to bring it to a market where we think it can still sell? And I think that's the perfect example of where we kind of sit with wanting to bring, again, those highly detailed models, but bringing it to a point where people will buy it and enjoy it.
Looking at another element of what you offer. So you select the models and you make paint schemes you produce them in paint schemes that they would have worn in their working life. So example, you've got these Baldwin Sharknose diesel locomotives, and you're offering them in New York Central and Pennsylvania Railroad and B&O, which they had. You've got the D&H Sharknoses, which, great, that's a huge nostalgia trip for a lot, and that is a cool scheme. And then you've got some fictional paint schemes based on railroads that could have bought them that didn't. Like you've got DMIR and Southern Pacific, which never owned any, but yeah, looks good on there. And then you've got the U.S. Air Force scheme, where this locomotive looks like a P-51 melded with a diesel locomotive, because it's got the Air Force insignia on the side with the yellow band, and it's got that toothy grin going across the nose. I mean, it is striking. It is wonderfully crazy.
But you know what, Nick? Would you be surprised if I told you? Would you be surprised if I told you that we're almost sold out of those?
I wouldn't, because it is wonderful to look at in its insanity.
Right? And that's what's fun about it. Now, with the shark noses, the railroads that we made, the DMIR, for example, they purchased shark noses, but their shark noses retained the Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern paint scheme. Whereas ours, we made ours as if they were repainted into the freight scheme at the time. Santa Fe and Southern Pacific both tested the shark noses in real life. They never actually bought it, but a what if scenario is what if they bought it and let's put a paint scheme on it that they were wearing at the time, freight wise, which was Black Widow and Santa Fe's bookend scheme. Conrail is another one that we're doing. Central Railroad of New Jersey is another one, but the fantasy schemes are just fun. There are a good handful of modelers that like to collect the fantasy schemes. Another one that is an example for us is the Reading T1s and N scale that we're making that just came out. We did a Conrail version of it because the locomotive was supposed to be a part of this Conrail steam program that just never came to fruition, but the drawings were like done for what the engine would look like if it was painted into Conrail. And Lionel has made that version of the T1. We made it in N scale, and they sell really well. So I think a lot of people, even though there are a really big majority of modelers that like to have the prototype model, there are still another side of the hobby that likes to have fun and likes to get those, those Air Force shark noses or those Conrail Reading T1s or the Black Widow shark noses, whatever they might be. And that's still part of this hobby, is that you are in it to have fun. And if you want to run an AA set of Air Force shark noses on your club layout, you can do that. And that's what we like to encourage, because I know for a lot of younger modelers, I'm a part of the Orlando Society of Model Railroaders here in Florida. And there are several younger modelers under the age of 16 that don't necessarily want to run their train prototypically, but they just want to mix a bunch of cars together, put their engine on the front, and just run it and have a blast. And that's totally fine. If the guy wants to run, we had a kid last weekend that had a Santa Fe Texas 210-4, and he put his CSX-9 behind it and ran some freight cars behind it. And if they want to do that, that's great. That's what keeps them in the hobby, and that's what keeps people interested. And that's what it is. It is a hobby. It's supposed to be fun. And if you want to get a fantasy scheme of an engine that you like a shark nose, then go for it. And we encourage that. And like I said, there's been some cases where the fantasy schemes have sold better than the prototypical scheme. And it's just another aspect of the hobby that's fun. I know some people will say that we like to kind of go off of what Lionel and a few others have done in terms of like fantasy schemes and whatnot. But you know what? It's like I said, it's another aspect of the hobby. It's not all about sales. It's about what people might like and what they might want at home. And if people want to get an Air Force or an Army shark nose, we're doing another couple of fantasy schemes with the AC 6000. We're doing Santa Fe war bonnet, freight war bonnet, like super fleet style in end scale for those AC 6000s. We're doing a support our troops AC 6000, and the support our troops one has sold better than like 4 or 5 different other prototypical paint schemes, including Union Pacific. So everybody has their select interest in what they like. It's just trying to find that fine line as to what people will want. And again, that just makes it part of the fun of having a model railroad company, is offering a lot of different versions and hoping that people enjoy it. And a lot of times they do.
It doesn't surprise me that they exist out there in the sense that, as somebody who's followed the O-scale market for a while, I've certainly seen a lot of the fantasy schemes that companies like Lionel and Mike's Train House have done. It's a bit more shocking to see the demand for that in, say, N scale, especially DCC equipped N scale. But there is a charm to it, even though as a Central Virginia guy looking at your N scale and Norfolk and Western Y-class engines in the maroon and blue schemes is a little uncanny valley. I can totally get behind it from a it's about having fun standpoint, and I think it's great to have that mentality. And it's good that it's something that can offer a form of creativity and expression that customers respond to. So your design team is having fun, and your customers are having fun with it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you what, we get, I want to say at least 4 or 5 emails a year from different people who have different fantasy scheme ideas, and they actually draw up their own version. We had a guy, when we announced our GS4s, he sent us an Amtrak fantasy scheme, a chassis system fantasy scheme, all different from what other companies have offered. What else did he give us? He gave us a like Conrail executive, like what the Conrail E-units, like that kind of color scheme was. And then he gave us another one. I can't remember off the top of my head. Maybe it was like a black bonnet or something like that. But he gave us like 4 or 5 different versions. And we were like, should we go with some of this? And like I said, it's fun to think about the what ifs on that sort of scenario, like a shark nose. But a lot of times it can just be just plain fun just to see what happens. The GS4s, we actually did do a fantasy scheme. We did the Western Pacific like passenger scheme. That would go well with a California Zephyr set at the front. It's got the silver and the red-orange stripe on the side. And it's a Train World exclusive. So if you're looking to get one, you'd get it through Train World. But a lot of times, like I said, the fantasy schemes sell so much more well than they do the prototype schemes. And it's just another fun idea of people to get involved and to, like you said, have that creative expression, especially in a hobby that is supposed to be about using your imagination to create a scene on a wooden table. I hate to kind of put it that way, but it is true. You're trying to recreate a scene or create your own scene of what you have in your head, and it's a great form of creative expression.
When we think of the fun of model railroading, there's building the railroad and playing with the railroad itself. Something that you got into even before you took on your current role with BLI is TikTok. What is model railroad TikTok like as a community? What's been your experience in creating content there?
Very positive. There are a lot of really talented and amazing modelers on TikTok and even on Instagram. When we get people sending us in videos or photos of their models on their club layout or home layout, and they're running it and enjoying it, it's overall very positive, I would say. I will say too, I was a little surprised as to how many younger modelers there are on TikTok. There are still a handful of like really good prototype modelers, but there's also still guys that are having fun. OJ Salas, Big Boys Trains on TikTok, is a guy that I followed for a while, and he and I are pretty good friends. And his layout is not prototypical, but it's something that he likes to, create and have fun with. But he just is always hanging out with a couple other guys that he's been friends with through TikTok and through the community that are just so supportive, so fun. They are all about just getting together and having a good time and watching the trains run. And that's kind of what it all kind of comes down to with this hobby. Yes, there's always the fun of switching out a yard or switching out a local industry or running a passenger train to a timetable on a fast clock, all of which are fun. But there's something to just say to just kind of sit back, hang out with some friends of yours, watch the trains run, blow for a grade crossing, pull into the station, that sort of thing. But there's a lot of people on TikTok that are into model railroading. And I started it in the pandemic just because, like everybody else, you're cooped up at home and you don't have really anything else really to do. And at the time I was living in the city and my parents lived in the suburbs of Chicago. And so every once in a while I'd go out, and if I got a new train, it was in something that I could show on my dad's home layout and test run it. And I was trying my best to be the TikTok version of James Wright, but trying to do like little reviews and such, and gained a little bit of a following. I'm just under 10,000 followers on TikTok as of right now. And it's a community that has grown, and I always try my best to be positive on it and have fun with it, because like I said, even with there being a lot of younger modelers, I remember when I was a kid, I didn't really have anybody to be friends with besides my dad and his friends that were into the hobby. There was nobody my age that I could look up to, or that I could be friends with that were into the hobby. And I didn't have any people that were in about the age where I'm in now, in my early 30s, and people to look up to and be like, wow, that kid, likes trains for all his time growing up, and look at how great his set is, and look how great his Super Chief is, or look how great his Broadway limited passenger train is. And never had anybody like that growing up. So when I try to interact with people on the app or even on any other social platform, just trying to be positive and just try to, encourage them. If they want to stick in the hobby, they can. There's always a place for it. You can leave it. You can come back to it. Like I said, overall, very positive community. Very happy to be a part of it. And very happy to spread the joy of watching a train go by. I have a lot of parents that have followed my account because they have kids who are, 5, 6, 7 years old, and they like watching the trains run. And if it's something that they're doing and that my train pops up and they can show it to their kid and their kid gets amused by it. And that's how you kind of develop that interest. I know you talked to Lucy Dormont of the NMRA, and her and I have had many conversations about how keeping kids into the hobby, especially, I grew up fortunate where my dad was in the hobby, but I know there's a lot of kids whose parents or grandparents aren't in the hobby, and they aren't sure how to keep them in the hobby, or they're looking for advice as to keep encouraging it. And unfortunately, there are a handful of people that think that it's just a phase and they just let it kind of go in and out. But keeping that positivity, keeping that energy up, where people can, especially again, the younger generations, can look at you as a source of inspiration to keep them in the hobby. Because the more the youth gets involved and gets excited about new projects and they do their research on trains, that passion just grows. And I remember many of times where I'd be sitting on the bus going home and I'm looking up, what the latest info is on 3985's rebuild, or I'm looking up train videos on YouTube, or thinking about what Pentrex video I wanted to watch when I get home, or, stuff like that. It's all for getting the hobby to a good future. I think that the hobby is in good hands in the future.
Which ties perfectly with my last question for you, Curtis, which is as you're looking at that future, both through your personal interactions as well as through your work, what makes you most optimistic about how people are engaging with this?
I like I said, I think that the more people that get involved and the more people that are positive and open to inviting people into the hobby and um, keeping that um, keeping that passion growing from such a young age. I see a lot of that being at my club. I see a lot of very supportive parents and grandparents who are, very happy to have their kid come to the club, and they'll talk to me or a couple other older club members, and they'll talk about trains. And sometimes those kids are way more knowledgeable about the inner workings of a train or about the prototype of a train than I am or the older gentlemen in the club are. And that's great because then you have that passion already rooted in them and they're getting there. And I see a lot of it, not only just in model railroading, but in preservation too, and in real railroading. And I think if that passion is rooted in the prototype and in the real thing, it all bleeds down into model railroading and into the other aspect of the hobby. And I think that there's a very bright future for the hobby. I know sometimes people will kind of write it off as it's the hobby's dying or whatnot. I 100% disagree. I think it's a growing hobby. I think it's a strong hobby. I think it's the best hobby in the world. I think it's the most wholesome hobby in the world. I think it's the most creative hobby in the world. And I stand by all of that. I really do. The creative expression and the ability for people to get involved with it and learn is got such a strong foundation that I think it's in a great place right now.
The website where you can see their current offerings is broadway-limited.com, and as well as links to their social media there. Curtis, thank you so much for joining us here on the Roundhouse podcast and sharing your enthusiasm, a little bit behind the scenes of how these fun little toys that we get to have on our layout are made. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nick, and looking forward to coming back next time.
And now, the question of the day.
Last time on the Roundhouse, we were talking to Roger Furing about how to keep your diesel locomotive in EPA compliance. And given that I love to ensure that you name it and we discuss it, I asked you guys, what are topics that you would like for me to cover on the podcast? I received a ton of responses. I appreciate you sending those in, and I've looked through all of them. Even if I don't respond to it here, it could appear in the future. From the roundhousepodcast.com, Dawn suggests, what about looking into what makes Brightline successful? Good suggestion, Dawn. I've covered Amtrak on the show before, but I haven't covered Brightline, so I might look into that and see who we could talk to from Brightline. From Jimmy Lambert on Facebook, while I recognize there could be a couple hurdles to this, I would be interested in hearing some war stories from railroaders. Those, you probably wouldn't believe it, but tales so many older railroaders have from their days on the high iron. I agree, Jimmy. I would like that too. The key is finding the retired guys who are not having to worry about their jobs being compromised or that enough water's passed under the bridge. But I definitely look forward to those types of conversations. Liam Hoffman writes, freight car preservation in the modern age. What is the outlook for cars from the 1970s to 1990s being preserved as they are removed from service? Excellent suggestion. I think that goes for diesel locomotives as well. I think our nostalgia for steam sometimes clouds our vision, recognizing that we need to preserve what is on its final legs or close to being retired in freight service today while we still have the opportunity before it all disappears and we go, oh, somebody should have saved one of those. Jacob Wolfel writes, how museums manage growing collections. As time goes on, more equipment is being retired and artifacts are being donated. As many can see, this could result in large collections that cannot always be taken care of. Thus, many pieces are rusting away, being sold off, or at worst, being scrapped. How is that managed, and what does that mean for preservation of future pieces? Because let's face it, there will be a day a Jiva or an Ace end up in a museum. Exactly to the point I just made, Jacob, but I think that recognizing what is within our organization's capability and scope is a good topic as well. I could see a panel conversation around that. Last, John Mark Overman writes, one topic that comes to mind is the connection between trains and the autism spectrum. I don't want to sound ignorant, but there seems to be a scientific connection, and it is possibly helping keep interest in trains alive. I say this as a person on the spectrum myself. Good suggestion, John, and I want to talk about this because I've thought a lot about this, and I want to put the call out there to those of you listening to help me with this. I absolutely want to talk about the relationship between autism. I absolutely want to talk about the relationship between autism and rail preservation. I think it's one of these things where we know it exists, but I think many of us really don't, frankly, understand autism. We don't understand the spectrum. And we don't necessarily understand how to ensure a comfortable working environment for everybody. So if you know a mental health expert who, if they have an interest in trains, that's great, but specializes in working with people on the spectrum that you feel would be good for the podcast, do let me know. TheRoundhousePodcast.com has my contact info if you think you know someone. Your question of the day for this episode is, what are some of your favorite model trains that have ever been produced? Let me know on theroundhousepodcast.com. Links to social media are there. Thank you guys, as always, for tuning in, and remember that the Roundhouse is our house.